And we are back, this time with what I'm calling the S4 Redemption series. Hey everyone, my name is Steve. Welcome to Figure It Outy. If this is the first time joining the channel, thanks for dropping in. Here I'm doing lots of DIY maintenance and modification on a couple of different Audis, and generally I do a little bit of tool reviews and product reviews from time to time, but I am taking a pause from my current S8 project, which is over there, getting some other work done, to get back to the 25 Quattro S4. So just for background, about 2 years ago, I purchased this car. It is one of the 250 25th anniversary S4 B7s. And I got into it right away to do a bunch of maintenance and just a little bit of modifications. And the final crescendo of my work was going to be a jackal tune, which I did end up getting. And I went to a dyno session to see what the stock ECU would put down with my car and maintenance and mods versus what a stage 1 jackal tune would be, and some very interesting results came of that. Now, especially if you're not a subscriber and you're an enthusiast for these cars, I recommend that you go check out the playlist of the entire S4 build series on this car, and of course the last episode of the Dyno Day. What the punchline is going to be there is that this car is missing a ton of horsepower. So on the tune, third run, I only put down 240 foot-pounds of torque and 219 horsepower, which is pretty bad. These cars are, as you know, rated for about 340 horsepower at the crank. A car that has an OE tune, no real modifications, you can expect it to put in just short of 300 on a dyno, and then tuned, you can likely see, it depends on the health of your engine, all the way up to stock crank horsepower, maybe around 340, maybe 310, 320, somewhere in that range. You should be picking up at least about 15 horsepower and torque for a stage 1 tune on the jackal tune. So I have a problem here and I need to figure out what it is. So here's the part where I'm just going to be completely honest with you, because that is what I think this channel is all about. Figure It Outy kind of stands for me learning the hard way and sharing information with you so you don't have to make mistakes. And this is the part where I tell you that I did not do any type of leak down or compression test or even a visual inspection of the cylinders when I bought this car. That is absolutely what you should be doing on these things. They are quite famous for bore scoring, to be honest with you. So if you're going to buy an S4 and you're watching this video, make sure you take some extra steps during inspection before you actually purchase it, because I didn't do that. Now, I'm not saying that's the problem, but that is what today's video is going to be about. I'm going to start up the car and start checking a number of things off the list to make sure that the health of the engine is actually what it should be. Because if we're missing somewhere between 80 and 100 horsepower, kind of implies that I'm losing power out of like 2 or 3 cylinders, which is very significant. So here's the checklist for today, and to make my editing easier later, here, it's gonna go right here. We are going to confirm, 1, is the solenoid that actuates the intake manifold flap inside of the intake manifold working? Because if it's not, that could definitely have something to do with a major decrease in power that we saw on the top end. Number 2, is there compression in all the cylinders? So we're going to do a basic compression test. Number 3, we need to do a leak down test. So even if the compression is kind of okay, let's see if that we might be losing compression in a certain number of ways. Now, just before I get into things here, let me just put you in my headspace, because I'm a little bit worried about this, to be honest. Like, that is a lot of missing power. It could very well mean that the engine is damaged and it would need to come out and get rebuilt. There's no quick solution to this. And, well, I already have an engine build going on, and I can barely afford that one. I don't want to start 2. So I'm going to hope for the best and get into it in a second here, but we honestly don't know where this is going to go. I don't know if I'm going to be back on the dyno doing a test in another month from now, or if this is going to be a year out. So the car's up right now on the quick jacks because I'm going to throw this thing into service position. It's going to be a lot of work up front, but truthfully, I need access to the front crank so I can roll over the engine when I'm doing a leak down test. And even to do the compression, you know, we've got to get rid of stuff, and, you know, now the catch can's here and in the way. So I'm just going to get the car prepped and give me full access to do all these tests here. So enjoy a time lapse. Alrighty, did a cheater version of the surface position. I say that because I left the headlights in and just took out the bare minimum things to get some play on the front end. Of course, I'm using my lock carrier tools right here to slide out the carrier onto. And I pulled it forward about 1.5 inches, just enough to actually see and get a camera in this area, which I'll explain why that's important in a second. Really annoyingly, this hose is leaking. I found that I have a coolant leak up at the connection to the top of the radiator right there, which super sucks because that is a brand new part and that should not be leaking. So luckily I get to just ignore that for now. It's not significant enough that I need to deal with it at this exact second. That's something for later. And what I'm gonna do now is test number 1. And test number 1 is gonna involve me starting the car, getting it up to temperature. And then what I wanna see is if the intake manifold flap is actually physically moving, because when I was on the dyno last time, we saw that the signal was being sent from the ECU to the solenoid to move the flap, but there's a difference between sending a signal and the solenoid actually working and the flap actually moving. So when the car's warmed up, I will bring the car up to about 5,000 RPM when it's coded to actuate the flap, and we will see if the pivot arm actually moves, and at least we can eliminate that from our list of issues here. That won't solve whether the flap is actually making a good seal on the inside, but that's sort of beside the point for now. Let's just make sure that it's moving. Now, before I get into that, I'm just gonna explain what I will do immediately following that because I don't wanna stop and do a bunch of YouTube-y stuff here while the engine cools down. I'm gonna get straight into a compression test after that. So I'll be running around, quickly pulling all the coil packs and plugs, and then doing a consecutive cylinder 1 to 8 compression test. Now, I'm going to do it as fast as I possibly can because I'm gonna attempt to keep it warm and consistent. Obviously, things are gonna cool down as I progress through the testing, but I want to do a warm, dry test. So the car has been run, the metal components have expanded into an operating state, that's why I say it's warm, but I'm not going to be adding any additional oil into the cylinders because that would be pointless because I'm about to do a leak down test for test number 3. Usually you would put a little teaspoon of oil into each cylinder just to see if potentially there's combustion slipping out around the pistons through the rings, or maybe you have severe bore scoring in the cylinder. Like I said, there's no point to that because we're going to do a full leak down test after that. Okay, great results on that one. We saw a couple of different and important things happen. One was that, first of all, the intake arm is not stuck. We already know that from idle because the actuator was in the correct position and the flapper was up. And then we went up to 5,000 RPM 2 times and we saw that the arm was retracted, dropping the flap, going into high RPM mode to create those short runners. And that was great. And then when I shut down the car, it just reverted back to normal spring pressure on the pivot arm, and then it went back into the up position. So that's all good. Now let's get to the compression test. I'm only stopping to say that I'm using my Mighty Vac system, and I'll put the Amazon link in the description of this video. And most importantly, I have my extension, because you don't want to take this, or one of these tubes I should say, and thread it down into the hole, because then you're putting way too much tension on the actual hose itself. You need an extension. For those of you out there that haven't personally done a compression test before, after the car had gotten up to temperature, I pulled out the 20 amp fuse from the driver's side fuse panel that operates the fuel pump, and I simply let the engine die to both relieve the fuel pressure that was in the lines and to ensure no new fuel would be sent up to the injectors during the compression test. Then, with all the coil packs and plugs removed from all of the cylinders, and after I had already ensured my battery was fully charged, I held the throttle wide open using the gas pedal while turning over the engine 10 times simply by using the key in the ignition to work the starter. Between each test, I always made sure the battery had enough power to keep the starter spinning the engine at strength. Okay, now that that gauntlet run is over, I can actually stop and speak with a little bit of air in my lungs this time. Check out the results. They are another good set of results, but maybe a little confusing. So We have on the passenger side, cylinder as low as 140, highest on any of the cylinders is 154, and on the driver's side bank, we've got double 132s as our lowest and then up to 146. That means a couple of things. One, the good part is that our lowest cylinder is within about 15% of our highest cylinder. That's pretty good. I'm usually looking for around 10% would be great. Up to 20% is kind of okay. So like we're in range, it's not bad, but we also have to consider what that average number is, and it's roughly 140 PSI. The question becomes, is that acceptable? What was it from the factory? What's normal for a somewhat tired 180,000 kilometer engine, but also in still good working order? Is it 140? Not totally sure. You know, what we were looking for there potentially was something that dropped down to like 80, 90, 100. That would have been an obvious red flag. We don't have a red flag yet. It is a new day. It's time for test number 3, our final test, the leak down test. Now we're going to be looking for a smoking gun today. I'm starting to become a little skeptical that we're going to find one at all, but if it is to occur anywhere, I'm guessing it might be on cylinders 5 and 6. Those were the two front ones on the driver's side that had 132 PSI in it, but we'll see. And because I need to run around like a madman again to try to keep the engine temps up, I'm going to just explain everything up front once again. So crash test on what a leak down test is. Now, unlike a compression test where you're letting the engine itself pump air into the cylinders and see what the maximum PSI it can reach is, in this case, we are feeding compressed air into the cylinder via your air compressor, your shop air as people call it. And what we want to see is at top dead center, when the piston is level with the top of the block and both the intake and the exhaust valves are closed, how much air are we leaking? Because you are going to leak at least some air, but you don't want to leak very much. And when you do notice that some air might be leaking, where might it be leaking from? If you think about the composition of an engine block, what you want to figure out is air escaping potentially through an intake valve that's not seating into the head very well? Is the same thing true potentially for the exhaust valve? Is there maybe a crack in the block where air is escaping from one cylinder to its neighboring cylinder? Or maybe is there a head gasket issue and the air is escaping down into the cylinder block? So what you want to do is not only compress air into there, but you want to listen audibly for where it might be escaping. Because if it's slipping into, let's say, the head gasket, maybe you want to listen into the coolant system. Are there little bubbles coming out somewhere indicating that your pressurized air is escaping into the cooling system? Or is there like a little hiss coming out of the exhaust pipe indicating that it's slipping out through the exhaust valves? Same thing kind of goes for your intake manifold and intake if it's coming out of the intake valves. And then you can also listen around escaping air from the rings if it's coming out of your oil cap or your dipstick tube. Now, similar to the compression test, you don't need to have the engine at operating temperature necessarily. It's just going to replicate the best seal that your engine is going to have because once again, everything is hot, expanded, things are sealing nicely, it's in its optimal condition. And obviously that's what's happening when your car is running. So you got to try to replicate that as best as you can. Now, once again, I have changed a couple of things to make sure that I can quickly run the engine properly, but then get to the good stuff while it's still warm. I have the front end taken apart a little bit more because I'm going to try to pull the front carrier into more of a true service position so I can get access to the bottom of the crank so I can rotate it manually. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And obviously I have the packs and plugs back in and just the basics so there's no vacuum leaks. And once the car is warm, I'm going to very quickly start taking things apart again. I actually am going to drain the coolant so I can address this top hose at the same time. I just couldn't help myself. And I will very quickly get to work on the leak down test. I have to break my own rule about not threading a hose directly down into the spark plug hole just because I don't have the right fittings to pull that off today, sadly. So what you'll see is that I'm going to feed this hose down into each cylinder and then use the quick connect fitting to put it onto this end of the leak down tool. Now on the left-hand side of the tool, I'll be supplying about 120 PSI of shop air, but using the regulator knob, which I'll show you how to use in a second once we get going, I'm going to regulate it down to 100 PSI, which is the maximum of the left dial there, at which point we'll be in the far right yellow zone, the set zone, where you're ready to do the test. Now here's the setup. It is exactly how you would pull it out of your package. There's obviously different brands and I'm sure different quality, but I went with Lang Tools. I found this one on Amazon and I'll put the link in the description of this video if you want to pick this one up too. So the regulator on the left, that's probably the big key thing here. When you get this item, you'll notice that the regulator has some threads up here and this little knob is sitting up next to it. What you want to do to start with is actually just pull it down. It's not ever going to thread up onto here and spin it all the way to the left. What we're doing here is making so that there is no regulated air at all. So there we go, I'm at the bottom. Now through my shop air here, I already have about 120 PSI coming through here. Trying to give you guys the best view is always a little tricky. There we go. And you'll see that the left gauge still is reading 0 PSI. Now what we're gonna do is spin to the right, and up goes the needle, and we're shooting for two things. We're shooting for 100 PSI on the left, and as close to 0 as possible on the right. And it's a little tricky to do that. And from my angle, that looks about good right there. So we're just short of 100 PSI, that's okay. Now we're gonna lock in the regulator by just pushing it up. The last thing to note is that you will not attach the other side of the hose that will be fed into your cylinder to this side of the leak down tester until you're ready to actually perform the test. So the cylinder has to be in the correct position. You're not ever going to have this plugged in already and then regulate the air. This has to be done first. Okay, cylinder 5 that had 132 PSI is at TDC right now, and I'll show you how I rotated it into that position in a second. But for the sake of time, I'm gonna go ahead and actually just make sure this is still set at the 0 mark. I've noticed this regulator is a little inconsistent in how it regulates shop air so far, but I'll try to go quick to make this work. So what we're gonna do now is just apply that 100 PSI, it's actually about 96 right now, into the cylinder, and then we'll do a run around to hear if we can hear anything. Okay, so what just happened is the piston moved down. I could hear that the crank rotated, must have been from the air pressure. So we're going to have to rotate it back up to TDC just before TDC and try again. So the fact that the cylinder just turned over is actually a great opportunity to show you how I got there in the first place. This is an OEM tool for the B6 and B7 that doesn't have a central crank bolt in it. As you guys probably know, there are multiple bolts that hold the crank pulley in place. And without a tool like this, you actually can't grip those bolts and you can't turn it. The factory manual says, apparently, that you can put a socket on the alternator to turn it that way, but in my experience, that doesn't work at all. The belt just slips. So you need to have something like this. All I have is this guy on the end of a wrench, and I'm reaching down in here, which is exactly why I put the car in service position in the first place. And what I'm doing is just rotating the cylinder over while I have the dipstick down in the hole, and I'm just visually watching it to hit the highest point, at which point it's at TDC. Okay, take number 2. It should be just before TDC, so hopefully we won't see the same thing. Let's see what happens. It is clearly leaking. It's definitely coming out of the intake side. It's not at TDC. It's got to go further. What I've come to learn is that when you do a test like this, you have to roll the cylinder over just past TDC when it's in the power stroke. Maybe that isn't 100% accurate, but this was my 4th attempt. Every other time when I was coming up to and at TDC, I had the piston actually roll backwards back down. So this is how I've been able to find a consistent result. Regardless, this has been holding compression for, I'd say, 5 minutes now, probably, with about, well, it started out around 95 PSI. It has lost almost nothing. So I'd be lying to say that the engine isn't cooling down a little bit now, because there was a learning curve to doing this last test. But as fast as I possibly can, I am going to check all the other cylinders now. Before I talk about the results, I just want to address the fact that I was probably a contributing factor there of some of the leak down percentage. I found it very tricky to hit that sweet spot of where the piston wouldn't move. And I know in my head that it's only going to be a few degrees difference between having a valve perfectly seated and a little bit open. So like I said, surely I was causing some loss there, meaning the results that we saw of, let's just say 25% loss at worst, is probably not even that bad. I bet that all my cylinders are within, I don't know, let's say 10% loss. And actually one of them had almost no loss, which was great. So once again, we have good, positive results. That is confusing because I still don't know what the problem is. So where my head's at now is timing. And there is one easy and important test that I can do, but I will need the car running in order to do that. I'll be doing some data logging with my BCDS, and I will have to do that in a future episode. One, because we're getting a little long here, but two, there's one more thing I want to do before the end of this episode. And that final thing is taking advantage of all the access and the fact I can rotate the engine and the fact that I have a boroscope, so I can send it down into the cylinder when the piston's at the bottom and get a good look at the cylinder walls. Again, it's not like this is a major contributing factor to my leak down test results right now. Could be, but that's not the point. It's just this is something every S4 owner probably has nightmares about. We know there's bore scoring in these engines and everyone's probably blissfully ignorant of whether their car has any or not. But considering my access right now, I'm just going to do it, and here are the results. So now that you've seen those pictures, tell me what you think, because I'm not even going to hazard a guess as to whether those are good, bad, normal. Don't know. I'm not going to bother Googling. I think it's kind of hearsay. But if you've rebuilt your engine and you've taken a look at it, in the first 50,000 kilometers or something, what does it look like? Did you have an older motor? What did that look like? Any kind of insights you can give anyone watching this video and myself, please do put it in the comments. So in the theme of this series, redemption, it's not something I'm going to get this episode. I only got good news, but we still don't know what the problem is. And that's okay, honestly. And just as a teaser for what's coming up here, there is actually an alternate reason why my air box is not back in here. It wasn't just to get access to this. What I want to do is take some time and do a couple modifications that I've been waiting on for a little while now. So in the next episode or so, I'm going to walk you through how to fully remove the secondary air injection pump and the related vacuum items to that. And I'm also finally going to tackle something I've been really excited for, which is to build a completely custom air intake that, because I have the DTM bumper in the front, makes use of the true cold air duct that's coming in on the front passenger side, because I have done the aux rad deletion on that side too. After all, I figure if the engine's actually looking kind of okay here, and not to plant an idea in your head, but if the timing issue is actually just the camshaft adjusters, which we'll find out later, why not? Why not make a little extra power and have some fun projects here on the way out? Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I truly do hope that you're learning something from just seeing my thought process and how I work through problems and which tools that I'm using to do some of my diagnostics. If it has helped you at all, please do consider subscribing to the channel, like this video, and I hope to see you again soon.